and how you intend to deal with Google in general. Now, obviously, I'm sorry I thought the questions had been handed out. They weren't, but you ought to know what they are. Where does Google stand in the world? What ought they to do in each of these areas? Why, for example, are they doing the AOL acquisition that looks so expensive? Is it worth doing or not? You have another minute to think about these things before we actually start.
I think so, yeah. That's right. That you ought to remember from this course, and it is this one. When you approach a strategic problem, the first thing you're going to do actually is organize the industry, get a good industry map. But when you've done that, segment by segment, the first question you always want to ask in all these cases is, where are the competitive advantages, if at all? That is, do competitive advantages exist and who has them? Always want to start there. It's a simple question. It's an obvious thing to do. There are no competitive advantages. There's no strategy. Just go out there and be as efficient as possible. If there are two possible situations. One is basically where there's one gorilla and a lot of ants, or one elephant and a lot of ants, but basically you are a dominant player in a market by yourself. Now, in a lot of overseas markets, that is the situation with Coca-Cola. If that's the case, and you might want to think about how this applies to Google, what's the first imperative? You want to protect that position, because that's going to be the source of any unusual profitability. Second imperative is clearly going to be to make the most out of it. And you shouldn't feel bad about that. In a competitive market, no consumers can ever be forced to buy anything. Now, sometimes they get a real bargain that we can't do anything about, like air. But still, no consumer has to buy anything involuntarily. So you're always providing more value for money. And you want to think about, both on the revenue side, but also, by the way, on the cost side, making the most of that advantaged position. And then third, if you have to think about it, think about expanding at the edges where those competitive advantages carry over. So that's the second possibility. The third possibility, which is really the only area where strategy gets at all difficult, is when you have a shared competitive advantage. Coke and Pepsi, Rogers and Bell Canada, Marlboro and RJR, And those situations, by the way, analytically are incredibly complicated. In fact, the only theorem that starts in 1944, 65 years of brilliant people like John von Neumann and John Nash looking at competitive game theory that's come out of it is anything can happen. That anything can be a rational outcome of almost any game. So you're not going to get exact solutions to these problems. What you've got to do is look at them from a lot of perspectives to get a feel for what's going on. The first thing you're going to do is identify the players, identify the actions that they have available to them, and identify their motives and payoffs. That's just setting out the information in the game, and then it's very helpful under those circumstances to simulate things. It's also helpful to stimulate things, but in terms of analysis, playing the game and simulating is a good thing to do. Then there are specific games that do have outcomes, specific game structures that, if you don't allow complicated stochastic strategies, you only look at deterministic strategies, X does the one thing, Y does the other, have well-established structures and well-established way to play those games. Overwhelmingly, the most important of those is a prisoner's dilemma. And we've talked about, and you want to think about whenever you're faced in any particular market with competition among a few people about price cooperation and the incentives of people to deviate and how you're going to manage that in prisoner's dilemma. Second possibility are these entry preemption games that we're going to talk about today. And really the third form of the analysis is what we're going to talk about today after the break. It's just a helpful additional way to organize the information, which is to step back and look at this as a cooperative bargaining problem and see if that produces any useful insights for strategy. But it is basically the competitive advantage question, are you alone? If the answer is no, then things get complicated and you have to think about them carefully. Are there any questions about that structure? Because 10 years from now, if I see you at a reunion and you don't know it, you're going to break my heart. Okay? All right, now I need somebody to get rid of, I probably can do this. If I bend down, I may never. Oh, well. Bend up again. Okay, thanks a lot. All right, by the way, I'll also give you a piece of information. This is the last time I'm going to cold call people. When we do the Amazon case after Thanksgiving, I think, I will take volunteers. So if you want to prepare for that and get ready for it, you should do it. If you want to come back late from Thanksgiving, although it'd be really late, you should feel comfortable doing that. All right, before Ray talks about the basic situation of Google, I'd just like to get a sense, for people who don't know, what is it that you have to be good at to do search well, to compete with Google? What is it that Google does well in search? Anybody?
Engineering.
Well, engineering, but there are three parts to that and they have separate consequences. Yes? Complete results. So you want complete results, you want everything that's out there to be found. You want fast results, you want to get them back quickly. And you want them organized in a way that's really useful for you. Yes? Sorry? You don't want it to be biased. I think that comes under the organization that's most useful to you. The first of those complete results is what a crawler does. That Google has these programs that day and night are going out there, traveling the web and downloading pages to Google data centers. Now, I used to think that when you went to Google, they just rushed around the web every time you did a search to find these pages. That is not the way it works. They have these enormous databases. at Google data centers, and the crawler basically downloads stuff. Now, the crawler, to the extent that it is good, will produce the most complete results. A bad crawler will miss web pages that you might be interested in, especially in the recent ones that have been recently put up. There are better crawlers than Google. I think Google has about 2.5 billion or trillion web pages cataloged, and there are ones with as much as twice that. But incrementally, the value of the crawler is probably not that great, given that most people are looking for general things. And how does Google make up for the fact that its crawler may not be the best? Anybody have a sense of how clever they are about that? Who, for example, has the most esoteric tastes on the web? Tastes on the web. Who's looking for the most esoteric web pages? Your professors. So how does Google deal with them separately? They have Google Scholar. For people who are looking to get places, they have Google Maps. So they also have a lot of specialties that, for specialized searches, get you away from a general crawler. The program that organizes that information, and some of this is hardware engineering, you're the engineer, right?
I'm not an engineer, I'm just saying.
Right. So some of it is how they put the machines together in the data center, but it is the indexer that produces rapid results. It organizes those web pages, it indexes those web pages, and when you do a search, it rapidly finds as many of them as look like they're being useful. There are people, by the way, with better indexers and better response times than Google. Why does the Google response time not matter that much? Just out of interest. Where do you see it when you do a Google search? It's that little number in the upper right-hand corner that says this search took 2.21 seconds. Is the difference between 0.21 seconds and 0.43 seconds a big difference? No, not particularly. Oh, there's somebody who thinks it is? So you're there and it's 0.15 seconds and you say, damn, where are my results? It's very rare that searches take as much as a second. So the indexer, you can probably get away with not having the best indexer out there. What was the key Google advantage? Ray, do you want to talk about this? Where are you? What was the thing that enabled Google to take off?
Oh, I'm just guessing here based on my knowledge reading the case, but is there prioritization?
It's the query processor.
Yeah.
It's the way they present the results, and that really is what makes the difference, because most people do not get beyond the third page of results. If you don't have it by then, the evidence seems to indicate you do another search. So the query processor is really what they did. Does anybody here know what their first innovation was, what the first good idea was that they had? Yes.
PageRank?
Sorry?
PageRank?
Right. How did PageRank work in its first iteration?
Is it how many sites pointing to?
Yes. What they would do is when they download a page, they would also download all the sites that that page could direct you to. And it would add up by the sites directed to the number of those sites, and you would get a number. And they would put the most referred to sites first. They did that simply. What was the next iteration that they did? They weighted those sites by the number of people who went to those sites. So if you were pointed to by a site that a lot of other sites pointed to, that was much more valuable than if you were pointed to by a site that only somebody's 85-year-old grandmother sort of lifetime web page pointed to. That is a fairly complicated calculation, because then what they did, of course, is they iterated so that the ranks of the sites pointing was not just their unweighted sites pointing to them, but it was also the weighted sites of the weighted sites pointing to them. Do I have a mathematician here? What is that procedure called?
Algorithm?
An algorithm. Everything's an algorithm. My mouth works off an algorithm. All right, it's called an eigenvalue inversion or an eigenvector inversion. It's a common mathematical procedure to solve that iterative set of equations. And that was the way they started. Is that the way they stopped? Is that where they stopped, Ray?
No.
What do they do now? It's not in the case.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to express it, but I know that they've progressed on.
I mean, what is their ultimate goal here?
Catalog the world's information.
Sorry?
Catalog the world's information.
Right, but in what respect are they now started to catalog it? Anybody? I thought everybody would know about Google. Since I thought I'd know the least about Google in the world. Yes?
It's based kind of on the click-through rate, so on the number of people...
No, we'll come back to that because we're talking about ads, but...
Okay, so it's based on the number of people that actually click the
It's
site
based
that
on the number of times you click stuff. What they do is they now personalize the order in which they present stuff to you. If you've looked at a lot of car sites and you type in Studebaker, which may be the name of your old girlfriend, and you're just doing web stalking, what will show up first are the car sites. So what they do is they personalize for you, but it's not just based on your own experience. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, you have to be signed in for it to collect it.
Right.
It doesn't just happen.
It doesn't just happen, but when you sign in to do it, they try and personalize the search, and if they can't personalize it for you, they try and look for common patterns in everybody's searches to see what they click on, and they move things up. So that is really what distinguishes Google from other people. Now, one other thing. When they do ads, how do they do the ads? And what facilities do you think Google has for... Does everybody know how Google, after reading the case, makes its money? Paid search. Basically, the way it works is that companies bid for target words. And when those target words are searched for, you will tend to be in the top of the list of paid search if you bid the most. Are you automatically in the top of the page for paid search? No, you're not. Because what they are interested in is organizing the ads in the same way they organize the search results, so that first of all they get the highest... Where's my click-through rate, Nick? The highest click-through rate, because every time you click on that ad, they collect the bid. So if somebody bid $1.10, every time that ad gets clicked on, Google collects $1.10 from the person who made that bid. So they care a lot about organizing the ads so that the click-through rate is high. What else do they care about in advertising? Because they don't just maximize click-through rates. What else would you want them to care about if you're an advertiser? Anybody? Is there anybody here who's advertised on Google who's bought a... Okay, go ahead.
So they want to make sure that the result is relevant on both sides, so the merchant makes money
And how do they measure that? What's the
how
term of
long
art?
the person stays on the page, and when they click through, they bounce off the page.
Okay, what they're ultimately interested in is a conversion rate, which is how often, what percentage of the time a click to the page results in what is effectively equivalent to a sale or a lead that the site can sell, and so on. Why do they care about the conversion rate? Because the higher the conversion rates, A, the more satisfied the searchers are, but B, the more money people will pay for those words. And they have fairly complicated algorithms, again, based on a lot of experience and a lot of data, so that when they place the ads, they maximize the combination of click-through rates and conversion rates to essentially maximize the revenue and the usefulness of those ads. Okay. I just want to talk about one other thing because I think it'd be useful. What's the history of this industry before Ray tells us what its future is? What was the first search engine? It was Archie. It was in the early 90s, and it was finding academic papers that were relevant. What was the first popular? Alta Vista. Anybody have a sense of why Alta Vista did not ultimately succeed in protecting its position? Well, I mean, partly people were not completely happy, but it was a lot better than the other search engines out there. And in fact, how many queries was Alta Vista handling per day? Which was was an order of magnitude bigger than anybody else. If you read that note on the search that we actually put in your case packet in the hope that you'd look at it. It's 25 million queries per day. Is that a big number or a small number? Well, when you guys search, how many search queries do you typically do in a session when you're searching for stuff? 5, 10? How many per day do you think you do? 5 at least? Okay, let's divide it by 5. So how many people are searching on Alta Vista if it's 5 per day? It's 5 million. How many web users were there in 1997? 200 million? At a minimum? Maybe as high as 1 billion? Is that a defensible market position? When Google when First Income comes into this market, has Alta Vista sewn up that market? No. 97.5% of that market isn't even in the game, and some fraction of these 5 million people are probably not completely satisfied with the product. So when Google comes around shortly thereafter in 1999, does Alta Vista or Income have a significant first mover advantage? Okay, that's the crucial point. When you're a first mover and the market looks like this, and you can always look at the fraction of potential users that are currently in the market, you're not going to have big scale advantages, and you're not going to have a significant degree of customer captivity relative to the size of the potential customer base. Are there people here who still, in spite of all my best efforts, believe in first mover advantages? Don't put up your hands. All right, so with that as background, Ray, you ready to tell us where Google stands at the time of the case in 2006? And what your strategy would be here?
Well, Google had clearly established itself as a dominant search engine in the market. It had broken down Alta Vista and also pretty much broken down Overture, which was owned by Yahoo.
Now, all right, so let's talk about those separately. Overture does what? Is Overture a search engine, or does Overture do something else?
Overture's advertising, actually.
This is ad placement. And basic Google is search. Do you want to talk about those separately or together?
Right. Talk about them separately.
Okay. So what's Google's position in search?
It's far and away the
Okay.
It was like around 70+% of searches was on Google.
That's the leader. It's got 70% plus of search. Is its share going up or down?
Shares going up.
Anything else?
I mean, it continues to refine its algorithm over the years.
Okay, so it's refining its algorithm.
I think at this point, I mean, maybe this is what you're going to get into later, but at this point, I think that you've got a fair degree of loyal users.
Okay, so why don't we talk about... Yes, I am going to go there. What are their competitive advantages here?
Well, this is I don't know if this is an advantage, but the outcome of it is kind of, like I said, competitive, or sorry, customer loyalty.
Okay, so the basic advantages are customer loyalty or captivity, proprietary technology, and scale.
And it seemed like one kind of led to the other.
Okay?
Like the proprietary technology is something that they were establishing from the front, which kind of led to a lot of customer captivity, which led to scale.
Well, okay, so do you want to talk about proprietary technology first, where you stand on that today in 2006?
Where I think, you mean like where we want to go with this?
Well, no, is that still a big advantage?
Not as much. I mean, it's starting to become less so because other search engines.
Well, what was the original proprietary technology that we just talked about that separated Google from everybody else? It was PageRank.
Yeah, PageRank.
Is PageRank patentable? No. Is an eigenvector inversion patentable? No. So what is proprietary about this? And if now they all know about PageRank, has that advantage gone away?
It should, right? The competitors should possibly.
Well, do you have a sense? I mean, put yourself in Brennan Page's or Eric Schmidt's shoes. Do you think you have a big proprietary technology advantage that you might want to defend or extend?
Not anymore, no.
Not anymore. Does everybody agree with that? Nobody thinks there's an advantage in proprietary technology. Okay, go ahead. Yes.
Here's what I'll say. I mean, I'm actually in the industry. We call it Google Black Box because you don't know what the algorithm is, and because Google has the best engineers. Like it's very, very tough to copy. And that's why they.
Is the algorithm still the simple original PageRank algorithm
No.
that they had to publish in? I forgot if it was Brin or Page in their thesis, because they were PhD students, by the way, at Stanford in computer science.
As far as I know, it's not.
Of course it's not, because that's a matter of public record. You can go and look at their thesis. All these things are microwaved, microfilmed, and you can get copies of it. So what is it that makes it a black box now?
I think.
Go ahead, Greg.
To his point, I almost don't know if you should describe it as proprietary technology at this point more than proprietary.
Well, what makes technology proprietary?
The fact that your competitors don't have access to it.
That they don't have access to it. So let's ask the question this way, Eric Schmidt. Are there things you think you can do that other competitors can't match? And I'm sorry, your name is? Ian. And if you want to ask Ian for advice on this, go ahead.
I'd be interested in your opinion. I would say yes, and I think the biggest thing you could do is to retain your top talent, right? Because if those people get siphoned off, they can take their knowledge of the algorithm with them.
So it's just a matter of getting the smartest people, and they do really well, and that's how you...
I don't think that's it, but I think that's a big piece of it.
By the way, I'll tell you a story in case you're inclined to think that it really matters, that there is such a thing as the smartest people in the world. When I was teaching at Harvard, I got invited to join this elite dinner society where famous Harvard professors would talk about problems with an audience of other putatively or actually famous Harvard professors, and then the Harvard professors would react to them and talk about them. And the person who gave the first talk that I went to is a very distinguished economist called Kenneth Arrow, who is one of the great Nobel Prize winners with Milton Friedman and Paul Samuelson of an earlier generation. And he talked about the problem of collective decision-making. And I sat next to a guy called Steven Weinberg, who is arguably one of the smartest people in the world. He writes for the New York Review of Books. He's a great Nobel Prize winner in physics. And the Arrow talk is essentially about how difficult it is, in fact, it's called the impossibility theorem, to have a perfect mechanism for making collective decisions that you design ahead of time. So I'm walking out of this talk with Steven Weinberg, and he says to me, he says, I don't know what all the fuss is about. Why don't all the smartest people in the world just get together, figure out the right thing to do, and tell everybody else to do it? And I thought, this is a complete waste of my time. If he thinks that that's the way the world works, that he's going to tell everybody what to do, because trust me, he is both in his own opinion and I think fairly in the opinion of the world, right up there with the smartest people in the world. And if Steven Weinberg came to you and told you, and probably because he's not the most gentle character in the world, do this, how many people in the world would say, okay? So I'd be a little careful about the smartest people in the world. They tend to be like Michael Jordan. They're very good at specialized things, like Michael Jordan was very good at basketball, and they're essentially minor league baseball players. But go ahead. Well, think of yourself, Ray, in the position of Eric Schmidt. What is it that you're going to do here?
Well, I think that the perpetual improvement of the algorithm is what keeps it.
Perpetual improvement. Is that what goes on here? Does what's inside that Google box stay the same?
As far as people know, you assume that it changes. It might not change, but you assume it does change.
But, what is your experience with using Google? Does it get better over time?
I think so. I work more on the paid search product.
Right.
That definitely gets better over time. But as far as the natural listings, you assume that they're trying to make it more relevant.
So the proprietary technology is not PageRank. It is really a learning curve. And it's having people who are bright but need not be the smartest people in the world concentrate very carefully on improving your individual or collective experiences with search. Is that easy for other people to match?
No.
Where's my Microsoft? I'm sorry, your name again is?
Catherine.
Catherine.
No.
No. What is it that makes it hard to match? Well, who can throw more resources at this? Google or Microsoft? And Catherine, go ahead and answer that.
Well, Google, and they have access to more information.
Exactly. So they have scale and resources devoted to search, experience with search, and access to data. By the way, what about conventional economies of scale? Because it looks like those exist to some extent. They do, obviously, to some extent, because there's a search algorithm, a fixed cost or a variable cost. It's largely a fixed cost business. So they spread those fixed costs over many more search products. So when they develop a new wrinkle on search, they're spreading it over hundreds of thousands of users. You're spreading it over many fewer users. On the data centers, by the way, they've exhausted economies of scale. They got lots of data centers now. They don't have one big data center, which is how they started out. Any other competitive advantages here, Pat? Well, what about captivity? Do they have captive customers? Is there anything in the case that suggests that there may be a fair amount of customer captivity here? If you go to exhibit, I think it's 10, it looks at that little pie chart of the search behavior of people who use what search engines. It's the last exhibit. Is search like restaurants, where there are lots of restaurants you'll consider going to? Or do people predominantly rely on one search engine? What does that tell you about the threat of Catherine coming in and stealing your search customers? Is that a...
Pretty well.
Catherine, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So it also looks like there's substantial customer captivity. Now,
I'm just curious in this case, though, like, aside from liking the format of Google, I'm speaking about this as a user of Google as well as reading the case. It doesn't seem like there's a lot that keeps customers sticky, other than the fact that they like the format.
well, okay, so I think you're... Look,
actors.
right, I think you're asking exactly the right question. Because suppose somebody came into the market to compete with you in the face of these competitive advantages that they have. How could they get you to use an alternative search engine? Because you next want to think about, and what's your first priority once you have as valuable a franchise as Google's franchise? To protect it. So, what would get those users to move to other... Yes? Formally, that's all it takes. So let me ask you this. Do you use lots of other search engines? What would it take to convince you? Well, okay, when was the last time you switched to a new search engine? Okay. And why did you switch in the past? Anybody else? Yes. Go ahead.
I think it's sort of just the force of habit plus the trust that we have into the objectivity of information. And I think the habit is something that keeps the like most the opera. We try to make it better. And I think the standard of objectivity is set.
So every so often you do try these alternatives.
I would, but I eventually would correct.
And why is that? Go ahead. It's just reputation. So you've tried the other search engine. You get results that are just as good, and you say, yeah, but Google's got the reputation. Go ahead. Right. But it has nothing to do with the results on the alternative search engine.
Sometimes it is. Sometimes it actually does, because I think that I find more stuff with the opera.
Okay, so they produce a better, more usable search product. Yes, go ahead.
I was going to say, despite the fact that they have entry into everything else, their pure search function, they seem to be dedicated to that in ways that other companies aren't. I think there's a benefit to that. Consumers don't that search has become, almost synonymous with and additionally with Microsoft, it's like the launch bank and trying to say defeat it. Because that's not the case, but I think it's relevant.
I think it's absolutely relevant too. Do you think it's relevant, Catherine? The experience of being here? Go ahead.
And their whole position was, Google is great for search, but it doesn't help you make decisions. It gives you too many options. It doesn't give you relevant options. It doesn't have any sort of human overlay that's supposed to help you as well.
Let me ask another question. When did people first use Bing in this room, and what got you to do it? Did you consciously go to Bing? Did anybody just go to like Yahoo and in the search box there was Bing and you typed in as something that you were looking for and Bing worked just as well as Google so you didn't bother? Yes.
Well, I tried it the other day. I was searching for something on Google. I didn't find it, so I said, hey, well, let me try Bing. And I actually did get some better results.
Yes, go ahead.
The fact that Google now is learning the user's feedback from actually doesn't come to anger because they get more feedback about the same search, so they will provide you better results than anyone else, even they have more users.
Okay, Catherine, you've listened to this. Let's approach this issue of him protecting this market from a different perspective. If you were going to try and get into this market against these barriers that Ray has identified, how would you do it? What would your strategy look like?
Well, but I guess I'm not convinced that I want to go into this market.
Oh, pretend I'm Bill Gates.
Okay.
Say that again.
Fair enough. But,
Well, I want you to try.
okay.
And think about if you had to get into it, how you'd get into
Then
it.
I'm going to try and do something that take a different approach than Google because I know I'm not going to do what Google does better than they do.
Okay, so what are you going to, can you describe that sort of, so you're going to take it, so this is Microsoft trying to get into this, and you're going to take a different approach.
So then maybe it goes back to what we were talking about before about, the human overlay onto it to try and provide, rather than, if I know that most people don't get past the third page of results, rather than providing, 30 pages of results, trying to give more accurate results on a
Okay, so you're going to try and do better with the query processor. Do you think you're going to do better for all queries?
No, probably not.
So when you say different, are you going to have a better crawler and more results?
No,
Or you're gonna,
but maybe I'll target a specific market.
okay, so you're going to do a targeted set of searches. And what kind of searches might you think of targeting?
Maybe I go after things that kids are interested in because they generate the buzz about these things, and that'll help grow market share.
Okay, so you could go after a demographic market. Anything else? And anybody else have any other advice for Catherine on this one? Go ahead.
So I think we talked about the search engine as an advantage leading to customer captivity, but about the pervasiveness of the Google search engine, the fact that it's available almost everywhere you turn, makes it easier and more...
So there is a scale in just when you turn on your machine, you wind up at Google.
Or on your now cell phones or any portals you go to, everywhere that they,
Catherine, how do you want to deal with that? So say you have a targeted demographic or say targeted applications. Let me come back to you. When you had a better result on Bling, let me just say something for when you get embarrassed when you're fantasizing about your tennis game. The only reason I come back to you is because you've made a good point, so you can't get in trouble for no longer paying attention. But when Bling did better for you than Google, how did it do better? In what sense was it better? What were you doing at the time?
I searched through for several pages of Google results.
Looking for what?
Looking for actually electrical parts for...
So you were actually looking to buy them. So the search... I don't know why they're laughing. So is that a particular kind of application that you might want to focus on?
Sure.
Catherine. So actually you could focus on purchase applications, and you could be very good at making sure your crawler gets all the sellers, and you don't organize all information really well. You organize seller's information really well by category. So one application would be purchase. Is that something, in fact, that Microsoft consciously concentrated on? Yes. They did look at specific purchase-related applications in particular demographics. So that's one part of your strategy. What about this issue that was also just brought up? Given that if you could do this better on a targeted basis, how are you going to get people
Well, I have
to your application?
where I have the advantage in scale is with my Office product suite, right? And I know that I have a lot of people that use that, so I could somehow try and use that platform to try and reach.
How would that work? Yes, go ahead.
Windows is the most common.
Right, so when everybody turns on their machine in the morning, what shows up? Windows. If you wanted them to go to Bling, if they had, or to be reminded of the possibility of Bling, this is Bling, the search engine, not Bling, the jewel. Bing. Is it Bing? That's how good I am on a computer. Okay, if it's Bing that you want up there, how can you remind them that Bing is available to generate traffic against what we heard of people just having Google be pervasive?
Put links in my Excel to get to Bing to do searches in Bing.
Or why not just have a Bing window show up when you turn on your computer? Sorry, go ahead.
They do it on Internet Explorer. They make a window, like you download this window, you have to make that little box on Internet Explorer. They come out of the whole Netscape lawsuit now because you do it.
They're not allowed to do it when you turn on, but anything you control that people go to, do you want to have a Bing dot there to compete with, where's my guy who has ubiquitous Google boxes? It's you, isn't it? Now, who talked about how? Is it you?
Some of their
Somebody said on their cell phone they see it. Okay. Sorry, wrong side of the room. Would it make a difference if almost every time you saw a Google box, you also saw a Bing box? Or a Bling box? Go ahead.
Well, the pervasiveness reinforces the competitive advantage. So Google uses that to protect their advantage. So unless Bing came up with a better search result and convinced me it was a better search engine, no, it would not make a difference.
No, but how is Bing going to get you to try them out? If your behavior turns out to be typical, that people turn on their device or they go to a website, they go to Yahoo, say, to start the day, because that's their first internet portal, or Netscape to start the day, and they see a Google box, what search engine are they apt to use? They see a Bing box at that point, what search engine are they apt to try?
Likely Bing.
So what's the second part of your, what sort of is the second part of your strategy, Catherine, that they're advising you to do?
Showing up.
Showing up. Basically having, because they also have scale in ubiquity. And you want to show up and get ubiquity of your own. So you want specialized applications so you can somehow moderate their cost advantage here and their proprietary technology. Because if you focus on that, you might do better in those particular applications.
Well, and theoretically, doesn't my Windows platform provide
Ubiquity,
something
right.
that Google has?
But if the government says, no, you can't do that, you've got to basically have it either through Yahoo or Netscape. What are you going to do to try and who are you going to go to try and get that Bing box out there? The ISPs. The people are the internet portals. You want a Bing box there too. Ray, back to you. What are you going to do about this?
Do the same thing. What's preventing people from going to the ISPs and thinking that Google's not their own entity? It just reinforces the message.
So you want to get there ahead of Catherine to make sure. And is there evidence in the case that that's something you understand? Why are you willing to give all that money to AOL?
Because I want to be AOL's only, or at least the predominant.
You want to be the one who has the box that appears, and there's my box man just in front of you, when anybody goes to AOL, which at that time was a big ISP. Who else do you want to sign up?
Probably go to all the broadband. Get them to do
And see if they'll do it too. But who's the biggest ISP at the moment?
I don't even know.
I mean, I'm sorry, in terms of just when you go to a site, I mean, which is the most, I don't know, when I turn on my computer and I go to the internet, I get a site. Yahoo is the biggest. So do you want to do a deal with Yahoo? Do you want to do a deal with Yahoo?
Yeah.
Is it a surprise, therefore, that these two are fighting over Yahoo? So the first thing there's going to be is a battle over who gets the boxes out there, who gets the ubiquity. Anything else you're going to do here to protect, Ray, that extremely valuable franchise against these strategies of Catherine's?
Well, I think expand the search to as many other applications as possible, right? I mean, you see...
Expand it or specialize it? How did Coke get in again? How did Pepsi get in against Coke? And Coke is the dominant supplier. If you read the book, does anybody know the history of Coke and Pepsi? Do you do Coke and Pepsi in your other courses? What was it that enabled Pepsi to take off in the United States? Sorry, somebody said markets? Supermarkets. They provided stuff for home delivery. If you wanted a Coke, you had to go to a drugstore or a soda fountain or a gas station where they had these big Coca-Cola coolers. You did not take large-sized cartons home because Coke, as a matter of practice, only had this 10-ounce or 10-ounce bottle size, and that was what they sold permanently. So if Pepsi wanted to go after Coke, they want to go after niche areas of this market that are uncovered. What should Coke have done about that? Cover those, get there first, and once Pepsi did it in the United States, what do you think Coke immediately did overseas? They flooded those channels with Coca-Cola to make sure that... Is there any similarity, Ray, to what's going on between you and Catherine?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can see it even in Google's non-search applications that they're just putting their name everywhere, right? So it just continues to reinforce the message. Go to Google, go to Google.
Is that all you're going to do? Does anybody have any other suggestions for Ray here? Yes. You want to have specialized search applications. Google Music. What are other ones you might want to have? Sorry? Frugal? What was Frugal? Shopping. What might you want to call that, given that she's doing purchasing? Google Purchase or Google Shopping. And you want to organize to do that. Any other subcategories of searches that you want to? Google Travel, Google Maps, Google Video. Sorry, keep going. Google Images, Google Scholar, in case those people want. Google Movies, Google Books. If he does all that, Ray, are you interested in all that?
Oh, yeah.
What's left for you, Catherine?
Like, if he hasn't done it yet, I can still do it.
You can still do it, and in fact, did he promote Google Frugal? Yeah. And where has the opportunity been for Catherine?
I know that there's been travel shopping.
Was there, in fact, a Google Travel? When you read the case and you look at the specific applications that they're doing, do you see anything like that in this case, right? But if you thought through how Catherine was likely to come after you, you're certainly doing something about the ubiquity, but are you doing anything about her targeted entry?
Not quite as much.
What's going to happen now? How did you launch Bing? And how might you want to have launched Bing? Catherine.
I'm going to develop a reputation for being really good at travel searches, and then people are going to start talking, and then that'll allow them to, rather than automatically go to Google, perhaps start coming to me for their other searches to see if I'm as good at,
Let me ask you the fundamental question. Do you want Google to come after you or not?
No. I mean, eventually, probably yes.
You want them to come after you, you can't avoid them coming after you.
You can't, they're going to, whether you like it or not, they're eventually, if your name gets out there and you get popular, they're going to come after you because you're a threat to their core business.
If that happens, how much money are you likely to make in this?
It's a losing proposition.
Yes.
That's usually plays back to your whole thing about people who are going to be basically communicating when they're not, and the way they communicate is they put the biggest single investment against this program. Certain facts that they've done a long time. Microsoft.
Right. Do you want to do this publicly as a challenge to Ray? Or do you want to do this quietly as just a new business service that you're offering Microsoft customers?
Quietly, because if I go with the full frontal attack, it's going to raise his attention and going to get him doing exactly what I'm doing, but probably better and faster.
Ray, if she announces and spends, how much did they spend on advertising? $100 million on advertising that says, here comes Bing, and for the sophisticated users like me, it came out as, here comes Bling.
I think for a company like Microsoft, to take the approach that they're going to quietly sneak into the market,
Well,
kind of a pipe dream, really.
do you have is there any way you might want to do this? Or anybody have any advice for Catherine on how to do this that she might be able to do it quietly? Yes, go ahead.
I just had a different point, which is when Microsoft released Bing, the name Bing is no longer associated with Microsoft. So there's also a branding issue. When Google releases everything is just called Google something.
Right.
How is that value or trust associated?
Is brand a valuable thing for Microsoft to have? Do you think that $100 million was well spent, so maybe they might want to spend $200 or $300 million?
And I think with Microsoft already such a strong brand, I think they should be able Google doesn't spend any money on it.
Okay, but are there harm as well as benefit to that advertising? What's the harm?
Well, the harm is that you just purchase it in expense and nothing happens.
Yes, go ahead.
Strategy is you want to be able to have.
Right.
And now you don't want to use Microsoft as a search name. Like Bing, that's what we use the name. I have no idea if Bing actually is Microsoft. So they want to approach this as low profile.
What's a low profile to do travel search services? Well, if you wanted to do a low profile approach to offering travel search services, what would be a low profile way to do that? Yes.
Put it to photos. Put it to Yahoo or local photos.
You could put it through local portals, but how about if in Microsoft Office, in addition to your schedule, there was a travel box which said travel plans. And when you went to that page and input your travel plans, they automatically sent you to travel opportunities based on where you intended to go. Well, that probably is legal. Because that is that, you see, what makes something illegal is when you get in the way of a competing service. Is there a competing service there, like there was in internet travel with Netscape, which is where they first got in trouble? Yes, go ahead.
If you were to pursue that much more subtler strategy and focus just on travel, would you run the risk that Google isn't going to get the message, but that Orbitz and Travelocity are going to get it?
They might, and what might you do about that? Partner up.
But so you have a box in your Outlook.
Right,
which
but
takes
what's
you
the
somehow to-
natural way to partner up with them? To have them advertise on your site in the same way Google advertises. What about purchasing? Can you integrate purchasing into broader software without announcing to Pat that you're coming after him? I think if you're a creative, you'll see that it's possible to implement this strategy. But now I want to ask the crucial question. 5 years from now, how do you think Bing is going to be doing? Catherine, because this is where you started.
Not well.
Not well. So even if we captured the 10% of the market that everybody is so excited about, in the long run, when Google copies us, who's going to have the ubiquity, who's going to have the economies of scale, and who's going to have the ability probably to dominate those markets? Yes.
I'm just wondering, because Microsoft obviously have unbelievably deep pockets too. Why
Does
wouldn't...
deep pockets help you?
No, but what... You mentioned in the other class yesterday that if these two people, you can preempt them or you can let them in under the assumption that nobody else would follow. If you can think that Microsoft was the only one coming in, why wouldn't you...
I think that's a very good point. How about that, Red?
I'm sorry, I didn't...
Oh, what he said is, look, Microsoft is really the only serious competitor here. So if Microsoft gets into your market, you don't really have to worry about a lot of other people following. Microsoft is just the one basic competitor there, so maybe you'll let Microsoft into your market.
No.
You want to talk to him?
Well, since I've already put up hundreds and hundreds of millions, I mean, you're obviously going to assume that I'm at a fight, and it's going to bring down returns for both of us. If you let me have the travel part, then wouldn't we both be happy? Isn't that...
If I let Microsoft try to take some of my space, they're a big enough competitor that they could eventually dislodge. Like, if they were really a mouse, maybe, yeah, I'd let them in and have their own little niche, but they're a big enough competitor that if I let them get a foot in the door, they might really break their way in.
Right. And is there any history about Microsoft's behavior that indicates that they have imperialist ambitions? Go ahead.
If you do this sort of communication thing where you test something else, maybe, like, I don't know, get into all these Google communication, all these different areas, Chrome or wherever else, maybe you get into an area that they play in and see if they
All
can
right.
play ball.
Let's talk about that next. But first of all, it should be clear, in many ways, Catherine's Microsoft strategy is a good strategy. She's going to go after niches. She's not going to try and do everything. She's going to try and get ubiquitous access because as long as two boxes are there, there's a reasonable chance you'll go to the Bing box if you find out that they're better in these specific areas. But did she implement that strategy quietly and unthreateningly? No, all the Microsoft people, every time they gain a percentage share in point, what do they do of the search market? What do? They put out a press release how they're killing Google. They've gone from 9 to 10%, and Google better watch out. What does that suggest about how Pat and Google are going to have to react here? Are they implementing this like a mouse? It sure doesn't look like it. So you have to be careful with what the realistic possibilities are. But just to finish this, and then I want to talk about Google going into Microsoft's areas. And that's where, Chris, are you here? Okay, so Chris, I'm going to want you to talk about what you're going to do to Catherine on the end of it. But is Google better at defending this market than British satellite broadcasting? You bet. They do understand the basics of trying to take all the oxygen out of the search boxes, get those boxes in every possible place, and they sort of understand trying to cover the target niches, and what is your guess about how in the long run they're going to respond, therefore, to Catherine? They're likely to shut her down. Yes? Okay. What about Yahoo? What's Yahoo's position here? What does Yahoo have? They have a portal. They have people who go places. What's the value of a portal? Where does all the revenue come from? Advertising. Is it banner advertising that works on the web, or is it search advertising that works on the web? Okay. There are two kinds of advertising. There's image advertising, which is where you see something, or, a handsome guy in a magazine with a car who's got a bevy of attractive girlfriends, and you think to yourself, that ought to be me, and notwithstanding the underlying reality of me, you go out and buy that car. The idea that products generate sort of states of being, and does that work well on the web? I need a web expert here. No, it does not work particularly well on the web. And then there is information advertising, which is the classifieds in newspapers, business directories, the yellow pages. Does that work better on the web or on paper? That works really well on the web. So what does Yahoo really have? It has a source for search advertising. And what it represents is just a front end that who's going to bid for? And Google. Is Yahoo worth anything as a standalone? And if Microsoft were to drop out of this market and not pursue Google, what would happen to the value of Yahoo? Not much? Let's go back to Ray. Ray, what's your name? Saruch. Saruch? Is that close enough? Yeah. Okay. Saruch is going to be Yahoo. How much are you going to pay her if you're worried about Catherine going to her?
I'll pay her a decent amount.
A decent amount. Once Catherine is out of the market and you completely own search, how much are you going to pay her?
Nothing for Yahoo. That's what I said last time.
So from your perspective, where was your biggest value? When Microsoft and when Microsoft and Google were fighting over you. And what were you worth then? How much did you bid Catherine for? $34 billion. Now it looks like Catherine's going her own way. And how many people think Catherine is ultimately going to get crushed here? How many people think she's going to achieve parity? Okay, she's going to get crushed. How much are you worth now? $7 billion? Right. Keep dreaming. All right. What about the Google initiatives going after Microsoft? And here, Catherine, I want you to talk about your competitive advantages first, and then what he thinks he can do about it.
What do you think? Sorry.
What are your basic markets, Catherine?
Well, it's the Office suite of products.
So it's basically Windows, the operating system, and Microsoft Office. What are your competitive advantages in those markets?
I think there I have a lot of the same competitive advantages that Google has in the search engine, which is captivity, proprietary technology, and scale.
Okay, what do your scale advantages consist of? It's a fixed cost business. So if somebody's going to write basic software, the cost of providing it really doesn't go up. with the number of users. Are there network effects that support you in that business?
Absolutely.
Yeah, if people learn on Microsoft Windows, they're going to use Microsoft Windows. If they learn on Excel, they're going to use Excel. If they learn on Microsoft Word, they're going to use Microsoft Word. If everybody learns on Excel and Word and Windows, what are you going to have to provide them with when they go to work? The same thing. So there are big network effects here. Is there customer captivity here?
Absolutely.
High switching costs. Could they write a comparable operating system? Is there an element of the Google black box here? There's some. There are probably some things, but this is actually pretty limited. But, you do have experience writing operating systems. What are you going to do about this?
Google initially, a lot of their initiatives were increasing customer activity with personalized search.
Right. We've been through that. We understand.
Now, trying to infringe on these type of markets where they don't have the advantage, it's pretty tough unless they spec on it to try to implement open source, to try to contribute to open source.
So what is your basic strategy here?
I guess it would have to be similar to what Microsoft.
Well, all right, let's start. What's your pricing strategy here? Okay. Is that a big part of your strategy? What's your product strategy?
I guess broad range of Google Wallet open source.
Well, Google Wallet is going after PayPal, but we'll talk about whether, after we've talked about going after Catherine, whether that's going to work out well either. So your pricing strategy is free. Yeah, go ahead. What's your product strategy?
Well, I was just going to say, where you have a big database of products, you could add the operating system in there somehow.
Right, but so you're going to produce an operating system. Are you going to do it once and for all, or are you going to match Microsoft when it brings out new improvements? Okay, so you're going to basically have a matched product cycle with Microsoft. Yeah. So basically, if Office improves, what do you have to do with your product? You have to improve it. How about distribution? How are you going to do that? How does Microsoft mostly distribute its product? It does licenses to the PC. Has anybody here ever bought a PC without Windows on it? You bought a PC without Windows on it? Sorry? Oh, okay. How many of you have found when you bought your PCs that Microsoft Windows was on it? Everybody. And that's because it sells a license. It doesn't, by the way, have to print down, the companies then just burn it onto the machine. And so there's almost no distribution cost. And how are you going to match that distribution? Free. You're going to offer it for free to the PC manufacturers. Typically, if you're a PC manufacturer and you deliver the PC, what operating system is going to be on there? How many of you are going to distribute it with a Google operating system? So when they turn it on, this Google operating system is there. I need somebody to be Dell or Hewlett Packard. Suppose Dell decided to feature the Google operating system. So when they turned on their Dell PC, there was the Google operating system. How does HP want to react here? Sorry?
Play them off each other.
Of course. You're going to have Microsoft, and who do you think is going to be happier when they turn on their PC if there are any differences at all between those two? So even if you give it for free, when those people turn on their PCs, what operating system is going to be loaded in there? Windows. So you're going to have to do something about that. Okay, and advertising. Are you going to advertise?
Have you done a lot of advertising? No. Okay. So you're not going to do any promotion. How do you want to cope with this, Catherine?
I want to make sure that they don't start stealing my market.
Right. But how do you want to make it hard for them to keep up with you?
I'm going to make it hard to switch from, hard to transfer all the data that people already have saved in Excel or Word or wherever into the Google stuff so that the switching cost remains really high.
You're going to want to make the switching costs high. But is there anything else you can do to make sure, I'm sorry, your name again? To make sure that Chris doesn't make any money? Where is he vulnerable in that strategy?
He's vulnerable because I still have it in the beginning. I'm already there first, right?
Well, okay, let's go back. How much money is this free price strategy going to make for Chris? Nothing. So what can you do to stop him? You're not going to compete on price. What's going to discourage him in this market?
If I keep upgrading my product.
Of course, you're going to raise his costs. First, Windows came out with what? It didn't work so well. XP, then they came out with Vista. How much after Vista did they come out with Windows 7? 2 years. How between Vista and the previous system, how long was it? 4 or 5 years. If she starts producing a significant new operating system every year, how costly is this going to be for you to follow? You can't compete. So ultimately, as long as you persist in doing that, and trust me, Bill Gates knows how to defend this market, how much money are you going to make? None. How much are you going to lose? A ton. Is it going to be worth it, Mr. Deep Pockets? You're now a Google shareholder. And he's spending $8 billion a year because that's about what Microsoft's R&D budget is in operating systems to compete with Microsoft. You a happy camper? Yes.
You looking at Microsoft's sort of range of operating, I don't mean their actual operating system, but I mean like their suite of products. Internet Explorer is basically, it's probably the weakest thing they've had for years. Here's the place where obviously they used to try to figure out how that was broken.
What are you now suggesting that Chris do?
Develop browsers, which they've done.
Develop individual programs which are attacking niches where Microsoft is not particularly strong. Does that sound sensible to you, Chris? Catherine, what do you want to do about it?
Yeah, I don't like that.
So what are you going to do about it?
So then I'm going to I'm going to throw my budget behind it and be able to...
In exactly the same way as Google is going to go after the niches where it did a bad job because they've been alerted by Microsoft, is Chris being quiet about what he intends to do to Microsoft? Has he been? No. Chris is going to rule the world, right, Chris? First Microsoft, then the Defense Department, then the United States, then the world, right? Is going to be on Google. How is Catherine going to react to that?
There's one thing that they have done is search like after giant in another area that's not really directly related.
So what should be the final outcome here? Catherine, what should you really do?
I should stick to my stuff.
And you should stick to your stuff. You think it's really going to happen? Lots of luck. All right. Why don't you take a break now, because I've got actually a moderately long lecture after the break. If you could come back by, well, this is the last class of the day, so you're pretty tired, right? Come back at 20 after, because I've got you till 6:30? Yeah, okay. Come back at 20 after. I can do it in an hour and 10 minutes.
Done exactly the same thing.
Right, exactly. So that's why everybody was laughing, because I kept saying great. I thought that was such an artistic game.
because they were cool.
Google OS, because netbooks and cell phones are all emerging. Aren't they trying to do? It's not the core desktop they're trying to get to go after.
Oh, thanks a lot. If to the extent that there's an opportunity they have to worry about it. Are they worried about it? Are there lots of cell phone operators?
Right, they are, but the four ones are BlackBerry and Apple because of the way they arrange their
Apple is it's going to be open source.
Right, it's going to be open source. Right, and Google's OS is open source, right? That's part. And they're probably trying to take Chrome OS.
Ultimately,
right.
One operating system.
Why?
Are you ever, let me ask you this, are you ever going to want, if you're exchanging data on your cell phone with your core computer, so you're in a meeting, and you got to go, we're talking about, and you want to put some data on what is
Yeah, I mean, people are using cell phones now. They're not really worried about that.
I know, but it's like that. You can't do this. Either you're going to get convergence, where all the functions that are now on PCs are going to move to cell phones, or you're not. If you don't, are the cell phone operating systems that are left the same as the PC operating systems?
Sure.
Why? No, if they're separate. People do different things on cell phones, and they don't have to be integrated with PCs.
Right.
Can you have different operating systems on cell phones?
Yes.
So, if all BlackBerry does is access Windows Mail,
right.
the fact that you've got Windows Mail is not going to discourage you from using BlackBerry. If they fully merge, so what's on that BlackBerry is the full range of PC applications. What's the system going to look like?
But I mean, if you go back to the year 97, and if I come to you and say like I'm going to start a new social media, and you say like go on efficiency, be the best efficient guy in the market.
And what is the crucial element of efficiency? And search engine. What was the crucial element? Was it price or product quality? And what was the crucial aspect of product quality that people wanted? Was it speed, completeness, or usefulness? So who was the most efficient search engine?
You mentioned that one of the Microsoft strategies Google got the lowest market when we update OS.
Yeah, they will raise the speed of
might come around. I'll go get the bus and stuff. I'll give you a call. I'll couple of minutes once you'll learn.
Not that I think you can jump to update
I want to go.
So what should they do in the meantime? How would you cope with that?
Typically, we have a cycle like after the update OS, we say, oh, come on, I got an update. Don't wait for 9 months to provide process launch.
Right.
That is
continuous upgrade.
No, but that is a pain point for users. I don't like Microsoft upgrade. People might just say that, forget it.
It really works two ways. If Microsoft offers the upgrade, you don't have to. If you're not going to upgrade to Microsoft, are you going to switch to Google? Which is a bigger pain, switching from Microsoft to Google Chrome or upgrading Microsoft. Just,
I'd say ultimately we upgrade.
Of course. So the people who are not going to change are not going to be hurt. The people who are going to change are going to look around at what the Microsoft upgrade is. Anybody who's going to go to Chrome is going to look at competing with the contemporary Microsoft system. If the Microsoft system is better, what's the chance they're going to go to Chrome? What is that? If the Microsoft system is better, what's the chance they're going to go to Chrome? So is Chrome ever going to be able to compete if they do not match the latest available iteration of Windows? You want Chrome to win, but it's not.
No, I'm not saying
That's why you're sticking your heels in.
No, what I'm saying is that currently cloud computing, a lot of competition is happening.
They were never going to cloud compute. Never. Why?
Because,
the only cloud computing we're going to do is within corporate. Because the risk of a virus, when you start going out on the web to do cloud computing, is so enormous. And the risk of the absence of control is so enormous. Trust me, nobody's going to do it.
But even then the operating system that runs on the desktop doesn't matter, really.
No, but what do you think Windows is going to do? What do you think it's doing? It has to have a Windows interface. It has to have an Excel interface. It has to have a Word interface. It has to have Microsoft data forms, because that's what ultimately they're going to do.
Google offers all that.
No, it doesn't. Trust me. Google does not. What do you think my first degree is in? Electrical engineering. My minor was computer engineering. It is a mess, and it is a bigger mess as these systems have gotten more complicated. To try and move to a new system and debug the mess. It is brutal. Trust me, cloud computing is brutal. What Microsoft is going to do, which is the way cloud computing is going to work here, is it's going to take desktop unused computing resources within a corporate network that is password and virus protected, and it's going to reallocate. Microsoft is developing the means to do that. Thinking that people are just going to go on the web and trust a web-wide cloud with their data and their computer is crazy. That's why we got PCs in the first place. Because people didn't like doing it. Okay? They could, but are they going to displace Microsoft? Who's going to put more resources into it? Who has the captive customers? See what you're doing, yes. And the real moral of this class is, especially when you've got somebody who's good at protecting their turf. Is Google good at protecting its turf? Yes, it is. Is Microsoft good at protecting its turf? Yes, it is. So who do you want to be? Google and Microsoft, or fucking British Sky Broadcast? With weak competitive advantages and no sense of how to protect it.
I guess the other moral is, if you're Yahoo, you get an opportunity to sell at 30 billion yourself.
Of course. In this fight, you look at when you're valuable and when you're not.
What happens now?
Growth that's unprofitable is really important. But the profitable growth is always based on, if there's no competitive advantage and you grow in a market of no value, what are you going to earn on your investment? The cost of capital. If you earn more, you'll just get actually lower the cost. You earn the cost of capital on an investment in growth. And you have to pay that to people who provided the capital. What's the net value created by the growth? Zero. The only growth that creates value is growth within the confines.
Argue that
Short-term
apps that they're building are more of a competitive to Yahoo than they could ever do for Microsoft. Because essentially by doing that, you're building a portal, and by building a portal, you're expanding the amount of time that a person spends on your space.
We were going to do a special.
I was in
you cannot compare those things because you still need a PC, you still need the full-scale applications and all. So Google, what it's doing is just taking a small section of it. It's not going to take over Microsoft or...
Exactly. It's not even a
What was interesting was, and it was really the training,
glad you paid attention.
the company executives in Wall Street with So every one of those analysts said,
It's like a little, I don't think I would even classify it as a major competitor for Google.
and I'm
the
walking
same
out of
space,
that,
except for some small segments that kind of competing with each other. That's what my take is.
used to write these.
At this point, it doesn't look apparent. We don't know.
But I still argue that if there was a better search engine, because Google is not the best search engine. I mean, are you doing more complex searches? It's not the best search engine. So I argue if there's a better search engine, I would switch.
I still don't understand how people started using Google. I still don't
It's just
remember.
freaking word of mouth. Like people's like, are you Googling? It's habit. It's habit.
Somebody said use Google and just talk.
Microsoft should exit Xbox.
You know, if someone came up with a brand new strategy besides PageRank,
That's why they all
I wouldn't consider it.
I think that's what Bing is trying to do, right? I mean, they're trying to make it more relevant.
Especially because they're assets. Because when they were graduate students, every good computer science PhD student had his own little operating system because usually Windows-based, it was better to them than Microsoft. So they thought, okay, now that I'm here, I can beat Microsoft. And they don't understand the economics.
And they just brainwash the shareholders.
No, the shareholders are rich shit about it. Google has margins that are 30%. Operating margins of 30%, and they've got huge operating margins. So if they've gotten bigger, those margins should have gone up. And those margins have been flat to slightly better. They should be somewhere around 70%. And if you don't think the shareholders who are smart aren't rich shit about it.
That's how it looks.
Should Microsoft kill Windows Mobile?
No, because at that end, they want it, look, they want it all. Look, the big uncertainty is the one you're talking about, is whether you're going to get seamless combinations of handheld devices, notebooks, netbooks, and basic PCs. If that happens, Microsoft wants to be the so they have to offer a really good operating system.
Free.
Yeah, perfect.
Microsoft may not want to advertise on because they don't want to deal with the strategy.
Right.
Probably has a guy whose job is following. I guess what you asked is, are you better off advertising so you can bring more buzz? Is that the correct strategy?
Such a good point. Ideally, you'd like to slip it in and dominate the travel market. The behavior you'd like to have when people, suppose you make an appointment to travel somewhere. So you schedule your vacation. You talk to your family and you say, we're going to go to X and we're going to travel on these days. And you put it in the computer. On your calendar. And Microsoft offers you the best options, offers you the best times, without you having to ask them. The first time you do it, you're supposed to flights. They offer you the flights. You have to show a preference for rail, what shows up is the Amtrak. Think about how addictive this would be. Yeah, I mean, Expedia does the back end of the relation. But they can also say, do you want to do something for tour, or do you want to do a deal? And if you want to do a deal, it can send you the you have the best of the deal. Think how that would simplify travel plans if you want to and that's the way they could have done it. And all the ads would be on there and all the you didn't pay for this, right?
I did.
Not too comfortable.
Sharing his care.
An outsider comes in and you see him probably kill a lot of these guys.
They both but they're so profitable.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Assume there's a number out there that Microsoft can get Microsoft. So let's say March is 10-15%. Register up. What is it they can purchase? So what happens at that point, right? How do you change your strategies and try to...
Well, I think
whatever that machine is.
the points I hope they have is the power is there. You got to be careful how you do it. If they decide to cut it, and that's the way, and that's really where your strategy is going to lead. Catherine said exactly the right thing. You don't want to go into it. So I think if you looked at it, John's is going to want to look at it. But if Catherine went to it, this Rob's understands, we can do this quietly and they're going to find out anyway. Or we can do it noiselessly and they're going to find out anyway. And it's going to cost us, and we're going to lose out in the end anyway. What is Bill Gates going to say?
That's true. I think well, they take
Right? It's done less money according to the law.
So there's Microsoft Outlook, right, which business people use.
Right.
Now they take it market
What extent can you type in that, right? That's probably time where, like, you have a cursor that goes over...
No, but look, just think about the application that no, I appreciate that. Think about the application that I just described. They can't stop you putting that in. It's such a service to customers. It's all the same. Car manufacturers can't put in car radios. I mean, that's not, and there's not somebody out there offering that service.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Question. What do you think Dell should do now? But isn't that shrinking? They're not going to grow? That's a simple answer? Okay. But shouldn't they experiment with new stuff?
Hungry, man. We're all here on a Saturday. Hungry to learn.
Okay, so going back to Google, the Chrome browser, right? If it starts doing things which... If it starts doing things other browsers are not doing, would you say, like, yeah, they're being better efficient now?
Look, does anybody give a shit about browsers? Is there any real difference in browsers?
Not really, yeah.
So who gives a crap?
Well, you wouldn't fault their Android strategy.
What?
You wouldn't fault their Android strategy.
The
operating system they try to put on phones.
Oh, no, that's the way to go. That's the grocery store.
Right, better than like...
But I don't think that's
BlackBerry, Android, and Apple.
They don't have
assuming we thought they would acquire Greenwald.
They could, but hold on, let me just... they might not be able... There are two possible... That's where all the action is in the handheld device.
From a unit perspective, that is the PC.
Where the computing is being done. There are two possibilities. One is that you'll have separate operating systems for those handheld devices and the basic PCs, in which case Microsoft will be fine because they'll own the basic PC and other people will fight over the handheld devices, or it will all become a seamless operating system. In order to do that, a lot of people have got to switch. It's hard to get to the second place from the first.
But then Microsoft is the winner.
Right, and then Microsoft is the winner again.
Are there 4 or 5 ever going to give up on that after time? I mean,
well, that means that if that's the way it's evolved, it means it's going to be a separate market. It's a fragmented market.
conglomerate of
You should get into, you might as well get into that market just in case, just so you've got a really good product in case it does.
It's been alive for 2-3 years.
I would keep it alive forever. If I could kill Xbox and keep that alive, I'd save a lot of money, and I'd protect the core franchise, right?
Apple doesn't do well with it right now.
No, I think it's got to be Yes, it's okay, can we start? By the way, I will be in my office after class. If you want to talk to me about your papers, it's 3:15. So what we talked about is the structure of strategic decision making. First, are there barriers to entry or competitive advantages? If no, you're going to be efficient. If yes, it's going to be, you have to ask, are you alone? If it's you alone, you got to protect, reinforce that competitive advantage and make as much as possible. It still has to be efficient in that case, but you'll still make good money even if you're not. If the answer is no, it's a shared competitive advantage. Those are the difficult competitive situations. And in almost every case, there are markets where you are going to have, whether it's local geographic markets for stores, small numbers of viable competitors. Those are the difficult things to analyze. To go through them systematically should be really helpful. Going through them systematically means first just identifying the players, their actions, and their likely motives and payoffs. And then if you have to, simulate the game to see how it's going to play out. On a game of any great complexity, that's essentially what you're going to be stuck with. But sometimes the structures of the games are going to fit one of two patterns, either a prisoner's dilemma, you want to cooperate, there are big individual incentives to deviate, you want to learn to play that game well, or what we just talked about are entry preemption games. In terms of those games, realistically, it's very rare that you have the symmetrical version of the game, where there's a virgin market and two people are the natural competitors, both of whom enjoy competitive advantages. Almost always you're dealing with an incumbent and a potential entrant. Now, in that case, the incumbent strategy is different from the entrant strategy. A good example of how not to do it, especially when your competitive situation is as weak as it is British satellite broadcasting. Were they fiercely competitive in protecting their core market? No. Is Google fiercely competitive about continually upgrading their technology, continually upgrading the efficiency of their advertising, which we didn't necessarily talk about, offering things like AdWorks that do more and more work for the advertisers and bring them the advertisers? The answer is yes. You want to raise the fixed costs. Now, British satellite broadcasting started to do that, but they did it in movies where they weren't going to be able to recruit somebody. They didn't think about where could they raise the cost to keep somebody out, which is basically in sports programming, did they run the operation efficiently to make it clear that they were going to do well? The answer is no. Google is exactly the opposite, as is Microsoft. They're very careful to keep improving search. They raise the R&D costs. They continuously improve their ad placement technology. That, by the way, you can actually see in the data. If you look in the case, you'll see that click-through rates are significantly higher for Google than other people, and that conversion rates are higher for Google than other people, and they go up steadily over time. So the prices of Google ads, because of the higher conversion rates, go up, and the click-through rates go up steadily over time.
That is due to an enormous fixed cost expenditure in continuous improvement in the proprietary technology that they have in advertising. They do exactly the same thing with search, and it makes it difficult for competitors to keep up. Microsoft does the same thing with the quality of their operating system. They continually add features, they continually upgrade, and they make it difficult for a Google, especially at a free price, to match them. In terms, the last thing you want to be careful to do is to occupy all the available niches. Just remember Coca-Cola in the grocery stores. You want to do it in local geography. You want to occupy the specialty niches, which Google is now starting to do, because Catherine's natural strategy is going to be to go after those uncovered niches. In terms of British satellite broadcasting, they should have looked at the income and quality niches, the South versus the North of England, the issue of timing, and then if you've got competitors potentially, you want to co-opt them. That the channel for Microsoft to get into Google's market is basically to get that box in front of people, as was pointed out, so they just naturally do it, and then if they've got a good, better product, people get used to using it for that reason. You want to co-opt the people who can do that. And you'll notice right at the beginning of the Google case, Google pays a fortune to AOL, than which there is no more useless $165 billion company in the universe. That is basically what Time Inc. paid in 2000, early 2001, when they did the acquisition deals. Microsoft does the same thing. It tries to cooperate with applications programmers so that it doesn't give an open niche to competitors. So this is a good example of how to protect the market. British satellite broadcasting is a good example, A, of believing you have competitive advantages when you don't, but also just not being relentless about protecting the market. If you are the entrant, the cases unfortunately are in the book, because when this course got shorter, used to be we did entrant cases, and a good entrant, which is like Kiwi Airlines, versus a bad entrant like Kodak going after Polaroid. And the cases that now are there that are most interesting are the incumbent defense cases. But I think it should have come out in this discussion what you want to have as an entry strategy. As long as you're facing significant competitive disadvantages, what will kill you is a powerful competitive reaction by the incumbent. And you want to design your strategy to discourage that. Now, in the case of Microsoft, they're really between a rock and a hard place. That they can go in quietly, and probably Google is going to see it happening. I mean, if you ask me how I would have done the travel, it's when you maintain your calendar and they think you're going to travel someplace and you just enter it in your calendar, a screen comes up that offers travel arrangements. And if they have a lot of experience with your travel arrangements, so that they know, for example, you prefer the train to the plane, they will offer those alternatives and have programs that will have your credit card already there that will cheaply make the reservations or send you to one of the discount travel sites that'll take care of it. Probably Google is going to notice that and react. Same thing, by the way, for purchasing departments. A natural thing for Microsoft to do would be to partner with purchasing departments to also, when you want to go buy something, to try and recognize that on the search and, again, do it automatically and easily. As long as Google sees it and reacts, you're probably going to get killed. Therefore, the temptation will be to say, okay, maybe I can scare them by advertising and attracting a lot of people. Which is the more expensive way to go? It's noisy rather than quiet. And if you do noisy, there's a 100% chance they're going to react. And if they react in this case, you are almost certainly going to lose your money. So Catherine's first answer, which was, Catherine,
Why do I want to do this?
why do you want to do this at all, is probably the right answer. But if we'd gone through this process with Bill Gates, your chances of getting him to see that would probably be better than just saying, let's skip it. So you have an example of how not to do an entry preemption strategy as an incumbent, how to do it, which is Microsoft and Google. In terms of the entry strategies, as I say, you really ought to just look at the book because that's where they are. What we're now going to talk about is, we've talked about laying out the information and simulating what's going on. We talked about a prisoner's dilemma, which is really about a stable market situation and how to get along, and an entry preemption game, which is when a new opportunity arises or you decide you're going to go into a new market, and how to think about that. The last thing that's worth doing is what we're going to talk about next. And it is because these are complicated situations, and there are situations where, and here I want to do, how many of you bought the book Coopetition, which was just suggested? It's a good book to buy because the people who wrote that book, Barry Nailbuff and Adam Brandenburger, have a very different perspective on what strategy is about. I think strategy is about not doing stupid things and doing the obvious smart things. They think strategy is about doing clever things. And what that book offers is a framework to help you see clever possibilities. One way in these competitive situations with small numbers of competitors to look for clever possibilities, to look for opportunities that may not have occurred to you, is precisely to look at these things in terms of a bargaining situation. And the basic idea is straightforward. It's just to step back and think about, suppose we could all get together and decide what was the best way to run this industry. Now, if we did it when we were competitors, we'd go to jail if we did it explicitly. On the other hand, there are lots of areas like upstream, downstream, or customers and suppliers like Walmart and its suppliers where it is perfectly legitimate and legal. So you step back and ask, if I look at the industry from that perspective, what's the best that I could do? And does that suggest other strategies, even in a competitive environment, that I might want to look at, or goals that I might want to aim towards? In thinking about those situations, and by the way, it's in these situations that John Nash got his Nobel Prize. And what I'm going to do for you, if there's time, is I'm going to prove the theorem that John Nash basically conceived of and proved, and you'll understand why he really deserved that prize, even though he was one of the country's and the Earth's craziest human beings for most of his life. So when you do things cooperatively, the first thing you have to think about is, how are you going to maximize joint gains? How can we get absolutely the most out of this possible situation? Boy, that is a ringtone. I said, a ringtone like that does not want to be turned off easily. Okay, good. I was expecting you to put it on the ground and start stamping it. But there is a second dimension to this. Remember, all these games take place over extended periods of time. And once you have cooperation, if you're going to have it, You have to sustain it. To sustain cooperation, to get to that best outcome and stay there, you have to be in a situation where pretty much everybody is happy. Because if one person is getting screwed in that outcome and is not happy, the cooperation is not going to be sustainable. So what you've got to worry about is what's a fair outcome. Now, sometimes people are just going to be so greedy you're not going to be able to cooperate with them. And when that happens in life, go ahead and screw them because they deserve it. At whatever cost to yourself. You're keeping them out of hell. Think of it that way. You're doing a benefit there. But with reasonable people, if they get treated fairly, they ought to be willing to persist in a cooperative arrangement. So here, the key to sustainable cooperation is fair treatment, fair division of the spoils and benefits of that cooperation. So when we look at these cooperative outcomes, you want to think both what's the best we can do and what's a fair division of the profits or the other benefits from that particular maximized situation. So when we look at this, we're not going to worry about strategies at all. We're going to worry just about outcomes. How you support those outcomes, whether you have to have a tit-for-tat strategy or you want to have separate territories or so on, is really a secondary consideration. What we're going to worry about is what are the best outcomes that we'd like to get to, and then you've got all these other tools for getting to that particular outcome. So we're going to look at things here in payoff space. When I look at a point, it's not going to be this height is the price for the B player and the horizontal intercept is the price for the A player. This is the payoff for the B player and the payoff for the A player. Now what that means is, if you can always move in that direction, you're better off. Because that's a higher payoff for both players. So the first thing you want to think about is what you learned in your negotiation course. Which is what? What's the first thing you want to ensure that characterizes... How many people took negotiation? What's the first thing they taught you to think about that characterizes a successful negotiation? Win-win outcomes. Getting to the best possible outcome, which is what it means to get win-win outcomes. In practice, in any realistic situation, you're going to have outcomes that are simply payoffs that are not attainable. There's no way everybody in this room can have a fortune of $400 billion. Just not enough wealth on the planet. On the other hand, there are going to be other allocations. First player A gets $100, player B gets $200, that are always going to be attainable. What you first want to just think about, and again, you're not going to be able to find it explicitly, but if you exploit all the win-win gains you will get there, is the attainable frontier between the attainable outcomes and the unattainable outcomes. If that is the frontier, you do not want to wind up at a point like X where both players could do better at a feasible allocation. That is, there are allocations above X for both players that are within that attainable set of payoffs. So the first requirement is that you want to get to that attainable frontier. And the question is, how do you, and by the way, the technical name for that, which John Nash put on that condition, is you want to be Pareto efficient. You don't want to be in a place where one player can be made better off without the other player being made worse off. Now, I've drawn that frontier as downward sloping. Why do you think that is? Could it ever be upward sloping? I'm going to try a precarious use of could that attainable set ever look like this? And the answer is no, because if you could get to that point A, you could throw away stuff and fill in all the things there. If you could get to A, you could always get to less than A by just throwing away things. And that means you could fill in all these areas. It's got to be downward sloping. For other reasons, it's got to be bowed outwards if it's going to be bowed at all, because if there's an indentation, you can basically divide things up in a way by going to the edges of it that make people better off. So it's always going to be a downward sloping curve. In practice, how do you think about getting there? And the answer is, you got to dare to dream. Just close your eyes and ask yourself, what's the best we could do in the industry? I'd like a single product with a single monopoly price, clearly. The monopoly price or a monopoly price discriminator is the best that you're going to do. What products, what plant capacity? You don't want duplicated capacity. You don't want duplicate product lines because that just adds expense. So you can imagine going through a checklist. In terms of pricing, you want a high basic price, and then you want price discriminating discounts to capture the customers who won't buy at the high price. You want coordinated pricing policies that, if you could, extracts the willingness to pay from every customer for this product. And you could ask yourself, what does it look like? And in marketing, how do you think about getting that maximum revenue from a set of products? You think about segmenting the market and charging each segment as much as you can get away with it. What's the natural analog of that within an industry? You want to segment the market and have one competitor in each segment and have them not try and steal business from the other segments. So you'd obviously like to start with effectively monopoly pricing. In terms of your product line, you want to minimize costs and maximize economies of scale in product development. You want non-overlapping product lines. If you think about telecommunications, you want one fiber infrastructure into every building and one set of wireless drops to every household. And that's going to be the cost-minimizing way to do it. If it's a car company, you want one company doing the luxury cars if you could get away with it, one company doing the mid-price cars, and not waste the money to have 9 mid-price brands, 9 cheap brands, 10 luxury brands. So you want non-overlapping product lines as far as you can. And again, there's an obvious strategy for implementing that, which is getting out of each other's way. Unfortunately, in the automobile case, because there are no barriers to entry, you can't do it. What kind of promotional strategy would you like? You'd like a lot of non-overlapping advertising and complementary joint marketing where that was beneficial. Again, you'd like to ask yourself, if there was one company that owned this whole market, what kind of advertising would they do? What kind of joint product offerings would they do? And you want to think about attaining that kind of an agreement with the separate people who participate in this market. If you're doing distribution, how many warehouse infrastructures and service infrastructures do you think you should have? One. If we had just, we have a lot of brands of tractors, but if in every locality there was one warehouse and one service organization, all the local economies of scale in warehousing and offering service would be available. And again, that's something that's attainable if you can have non-overlapping territories or non-overlapping parts of the market. In terms of manufacturing costs, you'd like to minimize them. What's the way to do that? Well, it's first not to have excess capacity, not to have a lot of plants that are empty because different competitors have built too much capacity. So you'd like to coordinate on capacity. And who would you like to have do all the manufacturing? And the answer is the most efficient producer. So you'd like to have a system of subcontracting so that if you were an inefficient manufacturer but you owned a service organization in a particular market or territory, you would subcontract to the most efficient manufacturer. And finally, in terms of risk, you'd obviously like to have, and this is the most dangerous part, you don't want to have price wars, you don't want to have capacity wars, you want to have nice, steady expansions. You don't want people going nuts. You want coordinated financial policies, you want coordinated expansion policies, you want coordinated investment policies, so that if things do turn bad, you haven't overinvested, you haven't over-levered yourself, and so on, and the companies, in some sense, don't compete when times are bad and make things that much worse with a price war. And if you can do that, which is the way the Japanese used to do it before they got religion and started competing with each other, you can carry a much higher debt level. And of course, that reduces the tax burden of operation. So you should go through revenue line by revenue line, product quality line by product quality line, cost line by cost line, and see what sort of arrangement would do the best possible in this market, and see if you could get to an agreement to do that. Now, all of you, I assume, are saying that is impossible. It is not. If you look at the book, there is the history of the lead-based gasoline additive industry. It used to be, and the reason you guys are all much smarter than us, that I spent my young life breathing in lead fumes from burned gasoline, because to get engines to run smoothly, you had to add usually tetraethyl lead to engines. It was an anti-knock compound. It was banned in 1977. There were 4 companies that offered it, and the first thing they did is they had common pricing. So what they did was they all had MFN contracts. They all had arrangements where they announced the price and let the customers buy for 2 weeks after the price was announced so they could stuff the channels, and they all went along with that. As their demand fell in half from 1977 to 1981, they managed to raise prices 30 times, and their profits actually went up, even though their input costs were also going up. So you can cooperate on price. The way they did it was they divided up the market. There were 2 small companies. The 2 small companies got 15% of the market each. There were 2 large companies, DuPont and Ethel, and they each had 35% of the market. They were not like Philip Morris. If DuPont suddenly went up to 38% of the market in sales, guess what happened to their market share in the next few months? Went back down towards 35. If Pittsburgh Plate Glass got below 15, somehow magically their share went back to 15. So they stably maintained market shares, which means that their marketing organizations were not very expensive. They did not waste a lot of money hiring sales forces to compete with each other. They would do efficient distribution. In general, DuPont was on the West Coast, Ethel Corp was on the East Coast. In practice, most of the plants were in the Texas Gulf Coast. If DuPont got an order on the East Coast where it was cheapest for an ethyl plant to fill the order, they would subcontract the order to the local ethyl distributor. If Ethel Corporation got an order on the West Coast, they would give the order to DuPont to distribute. DuPont and Ethel would get the cost savings, but the profit above that would go to the company that obtained the order. So in distribution, also in servicing, because these were highly toxic chemicals, so if there was an accident, you needed a service organization in place to clean up after the accident. They had an industry-wide consortium of service organizations in place. When you ordered production, the order went to the cheapest plant. So DuPont got a lot of its product from ethyl that had the cheapest plants. The poorest companies placed a lot of their orders in terms of cost structure with DuPont and with ethyl. Yes? No, it turns out that's not why it works. I hope I'm not being filmed, because I'm now going to say the thing that gets me in trouble every year. For cooperation like this to work, and it's why globalization, by the way, is the enemy of this kind of cooperation, you have to have a fairly strong common cultural bond among the people who are cooperating. The people who ran these companies for a long time, I was told, all went to Texas A&M, which is a peculiar subspecies of the American population that is like no other, and there was this common bond and they understood each other. The other example of this is obviously the TV networks, where they, again, lost huge share, and they managed to cooperate and were profitable for years. And this is where I get myself in trouble. They were run by a bunch of Jews from New York. And again, there was a common bond among them. They were very good at cooperating. When Rupert Murdoch got into the game, they no longer cooperated. So I think the answer is it's not just in dyeing industry. There have to be barriers to entry. So they didn't have to worry about entry in this case. But they cooperated before. In fact, the history of this industry is really interesting. What happened was it was originally a monopoly for Ethel Corporation. They had the patent. As soon as they went off patent, it actually was in the middle of the Second World War, so nobody could do anything. DuPont started offering the product sort of in 1948, which was when they could build the plant after the Second World War. DuPont and Ethel immediately began cooperating, because DuPont, of course, had staffed itself with ex-ethyl engineers. And then the oil companies, who had to pay for this stuff at these outrageous rates, decided, so I think it was Amoco first, decided that they would have their own captive producer of this stuff. So they opened the plant, and these are where the two small companies came from. And then they looked around and they said, we can make more money joining this monopoly than we can make by just selling to ourselves at a low price, because, again, they had to hire engineers from the existing companies. And those engineers were prone to cooperate. So you actually had entry here, and they co-opted the entrance. So if you have the right cultural attitude towards cooperation, you can do almost anything. And for years, by the way, the Justice Department tried to get these guys to stop cooperating. So they outlawed public announcements of prices. They outlawed a lot of most favored nation contracts. And where the cultural identity was there, the cooperation persisted. They also were not greedy, and that's the crucial thing, that they did not try and grab share. The 35, 15, 15 share distribution lasts for a long time. In game consoles, you had a brief period of cooperation around Nintendo. that the early history of the game console industry is that there are all these games out there, and there's no standard. There are lots of counterfeit games. The games don't work very well, and the industry dies. It goes from like $1.5 billion in sales to $100 million in sales. And then Nintendo brings out a proprietary system that they license to other game makers. They have a hit game, which is Super Mario Brothers, and they get to be 90% of the market. They have a single system, which of course reduces the cost. They have good quality control, which they can do on a single system. And they start out with an open system to the game makers. What they do is they get incredibly greedy. They try and steal everything from the game producers. They try and force all the margins out of the retailers. And of course, those people get together. They encourage, I think it is Sony, I think it's Sega to get in. Sega displaces Nintendo as the lead game console. Sony follows, and you're back to the anarchy and nobody makes any money. So it's not only the cooperation that you need, but it's also the willingness to sustain cooperation. So the first principle is that you want to think about being on that frontier. Now, between Google and Microsoft, what's the natural way to be on that frontier? It's to divide up the market. And it's actually to support each other's systems. I mean, imagine if you could do a say where Microsoft said, okay, we give up. We'll put Google on all our Bing boxes and all our Bling boxes. And Google would say, okay, we're tired of losing money in competing operating systems, and Chrome is just history. There are just obvious ways for all of these people to cooperate. There were obvious ways that if British Satellite Broadcasting and Sky could have cooperated, although in the end they managed it by simply merging. By the way, the other thing that the lead-based gasoline additive companies do so well, because they have this subcontracting arrangement to the most efficient plants, when they have excess capacity, guess which plants get closed? The highest cost ones, because they're not being used. And it's just natural for them to close those plants. So they also just get rid of the capacity in a completely orderly and efficient way. Sorry, did you have a question?
Do you have any notice about Google Corporation in
No. The biggest thing I would like to send you guys out of this class doing is having a positive attitude towards cooperation. When you get out there, for the most part, people spend most of their time trying to kill the other guy. The single most destructive chemical in the U.S. and indeed the global economy is not heroin, it's not cocaine, it's testosterone. Okay? All right, so the first thing you're going to look for is win-win things. You're going to want to be on that frontier. And in John Nash's terms, you're going to want to be Pareto efficient. The next thing you want to do is be fair. Have a stable outcome. And what he did was he articulated 4 fairness principles. The first one was you can't force anybody to take less in a stable bargain than they could get by not cooperating. And when you talk about negotiation, after you talk about win-win opportunities and exhausting them, which is getting to the frontier, what's the next thing you're taught to think about? The BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. You're never going to get anybody to accept less than their BATNA. The language of this that Nash used was a threat point. And what the threat point was basically a graphic representation of the BATNAs of the individual players. So suppose that by not cooperating, A can make 10 million, and B can make 8 million. You're never going to get an outcome down here. So this is an outcome where A makes more than 10, but B makes less than 8. You're never going to get an outcome where B gets less than 8 that's going to be stable. So you're going to cut off all these outcomes given B's BATNA. Given A's BATNA, you're going to cut off all those outcomes because you're never going to get an outcome in which A makes less than the 10 million here, where the horizontal intercept is less than 10 million. So what you're left with are just those points on the frontier between P and Q. And you should spend a lot of time thinking about what that BATNA looks like, because it'll save you a ton of grief of trying to negotiate too hard, and even if you succeed in screwing the other person below their BATNA, it's not going to be a stable long-run agreement. His term for that was individual rationality, that any stable agreement had to be individually rational. None of the cooperating parties could be in a situation under cooperation that was worse than what they could do by not cooperating. So the first fairness condition is you've got to satisfy individual rationality if you're going to have a stable outcome. So the fair points here on the frontier that you want to get to are P and Q. In the sense, when we've talked about negotiations in this class, that's precisely what we've talked about. So when you talk about the negotiations between Coke and Walmart, you think about what happens if they can't agree, which is how much is Walmart hurt if they can't have Coke, and how much is Coke hurt if they can't have Walmart. That's an exercise in looking at these threat points. I don't know if you've read in the papers, but Costco and Coke are now fighting. What do you think the threat points are there? And let's start with Costco. Is it that harmful to Costco not to carry Coke? No. Costco is a very specialized store. It has 6,000 SKUs. It does big bulk trade. Do you know what their biggest item is by far? Cigarettes. Because that's something that people spend a lot on, that they want to get a good bargain for from bulk purchases. Are people going to stop going to Costco because they can't get Coke? And the answer is no. There's still going to be members because there are going to be other bargains, and they're used to getting Coke other places. So the threat from Coke to Costco is minimal. Not having Coke is not a big deal. Is Coke hurt much by not being in Costco? And the answer again is no. People are still going to get their Coke if they want it outside Costco. There might be some few economies that they'll get it in the hands of some customers more efficiently through Costco. But there's not going to be a big loss here. So the threat points are very close to the efficient frontier. There's not a big loss off the efficient frontier from either of these people. So this dispute can go on forever. They could never resolve it, and it's not going to matter much. And if they do resolve it, it's not going to make a big difference. So you want to think about where is Walmart without Coke, which is what's Coke's threat point, and where is Coke without Walmart, which is the Walmart Coke response. Same with Intel and Microsoft. If Intel and Microsoft don't cooperate, what happens? It's a disaster. The threat point there is probably profits go down enormously. And that conditions how you're going to think about where are possible outcomes on that frontier. So on that frontier, it cuts off almost nothing when you think about the threat points because the threats are so dire. When you think of B-Sky B British Satellite Broadcasting and Sky, what do the threat points look like? If they can't cooperate, what are they looking at? They're looking at losses forever. They're looking at very substantial negative present values. So the parts of that frontier that are cut off by the threat point are all the irrelevant parts where they're both losing money. So the whole frontier is still a possibility when you do the deal in that case. Sometimes, however, the threat point will completely determine the outcome. And it's typically the case if you've got somebody with monopoly power and somebody who doesn't. So this is the case of people supplying paper to be sold through Staples. And suppose that the paper sales through Staples are worth about $200 million a year. The frontier is perfectly linear because depending on the price, the way they divide the final price between Staples and the paper company just determines how that $200 million gets divided. So they can divide it 50-50, they can divide it 75-25. It's just a linear frontier with a 45-degree line because they can basically divide the rewards anywhere they want. But what does the threat point look like in that case? Well, think about it. If the paper company doesn't cooperate with Staples, how much is Staples going to be hurt? Not at all. There are hundreds of paper companies out there. So they're just going to replace them with another paper company. So from Staples' point of view, the non-cooperation point is still where they get the $200 million. What about for the paper company? Well, if it's a competitive market, how much pure profit are they making? None. So if they don't get the Staples contract, they're also not making any money. So the threat point for them is that in all the outcomes, in the non-cooperation outcome, they get zero. So the threat point is the paper supplier gets zero, which is along this line, and Staples makes the $200 million because they go to a competing paper supplier. So the threat point is there, and what's left of the frontier that's a feasible outcome given individual rationality on the part of Staples. Staples gets it all. And there is a really important lesson there that is a trap that people fall into all the time. If you do not bring anything to the dance, you are not going to take anything home. If you are in a competitive industry, nobody who has a monopoly position is going to make you rich. What gives Coke power with Walmart is that there are not infinite competitive alternatives to Coca-Cola. So that's why the small suppliers who are in local competitive markets make no money from Walmart, because they're easily replaceable, and the stable bargain is that they get nothing. And unless, suddenly they decide to become charitable, which is not Walmart's history, Walmart is not going to start making those suppliers rich. So you're going to be at that corner where the person with the monopoly power makes all the money. All right, so the first fairness position is essentially individual rationality. Did they talk about other fairness conditions in your negotiations class? Because there's one other just painfully obvious one. If everybody looks the same, what's the fair division of the pie? Equally. And typically what you find when they run experiments is that if you do a symmetrical game and you need to sustain cooperation, a symmetrical game is one where both parties have the same possibility, dividing things equally is the only stable outcome. Because the guy who gets 60, if he looks and says, I'm the same as that other guy, is not going to cooperate, or the guy who gets 40 is not going to cooperate so the other guy can get 60. So the second fairness principle that Nash articulated is what he called symmetry. If people look the same, they should divide the pie equally. What does it mean to look the same? Again, we're just focusing on the space of possibility. So suppose when we maximize things like British Satellite Broadcasting and Sky Television, there's a maximum attainable profit which is $600 million. If you have side payments that you can make, which is you can divide up the profits by how you adjust the purchase price for British Satellite Broadcasting or how you set the price when Coke sells to Walmart, then that thing is going to be a 45-degree line because it's just going to be run from where the B player gets everything to where the A player gets everything, and for every dollar the B player gives up, the A player gets $1, which is a 45-degree line. So above the threat point, if it's a 45-degree line, what is the fair outcome? It's 50-50. And that's why it shouldn't be such a surprise that the division that you see in British Satellite Broadcasting and Sky TV is 50-50. Because the only relevant part of the efficient frontier is the positive orthant. If the threat point is losses for everybody going forward, the relevant part of the pie is the straight line in the positive orthant. In the positive orthant, everybody looks the same. And the way to say this is, nobody makes any money if they don't agree. That means that they each have equal power. And if they have equal power, you're going to divide it 50-50. If we go back to Microsoft and Intel, and again, they can divide it up just by the way Intel prices its chips and Microsoft prices its operating system, which determines how much of the supply chain for PCs each of them gets. What's the natural way for them to divide the market up? 50-50. Because they're both essential to the cooperation. The threat point of non-cooperation is probably that neither of them makes any money. And when you look at the relative market capitalization of Intel and Microsoft, what's the striking thing that you see? It's almost the same. They both peaked at 500 billion at the top of the internet boom, and they've all both been between 100 and 150 billion since. So in games with side payments, which are symmetrical, where you've got two people negotiating, both of whom are essential to doing well, the rule is you probably, if you want sustained cooperation, going to have to divide things equally. And that's the second condition that Nash articulated. I think that is a critically important condition. Because when you talk about why in life people can't cooperate, it's because they always tell themselves stories why they are the powerful partner and the other competitor is a weenie and they should have 60 and the other guy should have 40. The lesson of that is that they always both end up with 20 or less. The key, therefore, is don't be greedy. If, when you look at this range of possible outcomes, it looks like that 45-degree slope, offer an equal deal, and if the other guy doesn't, denounce him to the FBI for tax evasion, because if he's greedy about that, he's going to be greedy about other things. By the way, if you put it together, this is just the Intel Microsoft picture. Why do the PC makers get nothing out of this? Because it's a competitive industry. There are lots of people, except for Dell's cost-saving advantages, that can enter and make PCs. They bring nothing to the dance. If they shut down, there are thousands waiting to replace them. And more or less, since the threat point is almost at zero profits, Intel and Microsoft have consistently divided up that particular pie. So you have individual rationality, symmetry. Both those things, by the way, will usually decide how things get divided up along a value chain. That the people with no monopoly power get nothing. The people with the monopoly power, to the extent that they're essential to it, divide things up equally. Yes? Oh, okay. What's the non-cooperative value for AMD? What does AMD get if they don't cooperate? It's maybe worth $2 billion. What's Intel get if they don't cooperate? It's probably worth $100 billion. So who should get the lion's share of the returns? Who has the powerful competitive advantage here? And who lives on government charity? It's Intel. Is AMD really going to be happy accepting that? No. There, what you've got is a situation with one big elephant and one little mosquito. And it would be good if the mosquito didn't bite the elephant, but it doesn't make much difference if they do. And the mosquito is the kind of animal that wants to bite. Okay? If you just look at the threat points there, you'll see exactly why they're just as... Again, they're close to the frontier anyway, right down at the Intel corner. It's like Costco and Coke. They're not big gains from cooperation. And the one who's got to do it is Intel. Now, there are two other situations. The next situation is, what do you do in the case where one of them is just inherently bigger than the other? So above the threat point, as the market gets bigger or as that person gets more share, they make more profits rather than less. It's still going to be, say, a linear frontier because you're just dividing the market, but it's not at a 45-degree line. So you can imagine that for years, and it's probably still true, Boeing is more profitable than Airbus. It just does things more cheaply, pretty much always has, once you take away the government subsidies. If that's the case, then if Boeing had the whole market, they might make $700 million. If Airbus had the whole market, they'd make $300 million. That's no longer a 45-degree line where the profits are the same no matter who has the share of the market. What do you do in a case of a linear relationship like that? It's not a 45-degree line. It's not symmetrical. The idea that Nash had, and it does seem to be the natural extension of symmetry, that he called linear invariance, is that when you have this linear but asymmetrical information, this linear but asymmetrical condition, you should divide the proceeds proportionately. So if at any given point Boeing is 70% more efficient than Airbus, Boeing should, or 70% to Airbus is 30, Boeing should get 70, Airbus should get 30. Graphically, what that means is that where the frontier is a line where somebody, the B player here, gets more than the A player, the fair outcome is still in the middle of the line. It's where, and the way he thought about that is, imagine you went from a game with a frontier Y, say, Z up here, to a game XY. What's going on in that transition? Well, really, all that's happening is that for every possible payoff for the Y player, payoffs for the Z player are going up. So you're just adding payoffs to the Z player. And if that's the way then you get to the new game from the old game, which is just added benefit to the more efficient player, who should get the benefit of all that change? And his idea was the more efficient player. You should still be at the 50-50 point on the line, where the more efficient player gets the same market share, but now he gets, because he's lower cost, 70% of the profits, and the other player gets 30%. The other case where this applies is geography. If you've got one guy who's very big and one guy who's very small, and they have different geographic footprints, it's natural that you should divide the profitability according to their geographic footprints. So if one guy's got 70% of the market, the other guy should have 70%. He should get 70% of the payoffs. And if one guy has 30, he should get 30. So you have that. You have individual rationality, symmetry, linear invariance, and the last one, which I won't explain except, is something called independence of irrelevant alternatives. So basically, the last principle that's understandable is, and I'll talk about independence of irrelevant alternatives, when the frontier is like this, and Boeing is more efficient, or if Airbus is more efficient, you should still be at the middle of the line, where if Boeing is 4 times as efficient, it should get 4 times as much money above the threat point. Those are the 4 principles, and the last one, as I say, is independence of irrelevant alternatives. And what I am going to do for the last 10 minutes, and you are free to go, is I'm going to prove the Nash theorem for you. Those 5 conditions, Pareto optimality, individual rationality, symmetry, linear invariance, and the last one, independent of irrelevant alternatives, and I'll tell you what that is in a second, completely define an equilibrium, and they also define a bargaining path towards that equilibrium. And I'm now in effect, I hope you appreciate how brilliant Nash was. To just define the problem that way in the first place, and then to prove that the outcome was going to be fair, and I'll describe what the outcome is. So you start with a frontier, and you're only interested in the frontier above the threat point. So let's look at the outcomes above the threat point, above this line AB. And these are the outcomes in the game. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a rigid bar and I'm going to drop it on this curve. So I'm going to hinge it there and let it drop on the curve, and it's going to hit that frontier someplace. If I move the hinge point closer to B, where is the bar going to hit the curve? Closer to B. If I move the hinge point further out, it's going to drop it closer to A. So what I'm going to do is move that hinge point so it hits the curve at a point E where, let me call this Z, where the distance TZ is exactly equal to the distance ZY. Okay, I can always do that. If I start here, I just keep moving it out. As I move it out, this point moves towards A, Z moves in, Y moves out. I just keep moving it till TZ is equal to ZY. You can always do that. This line may not be 45 degrees, but let me draw then a 45-degree line up to a point W here. If the 45-degree line were the attainable set above the threat point in the game, where's the fair outcome on the 45-degree line? Right in the middle. That's symmetry. So it's right in the middle here. The middle of the line is by construction exactly above the point E. This is your high school geometry. Because these are similar triangles. This triangle and YWT are similar. If I move halfway along this line, I'm moving halfway along that line. So that midpoint of WY is directly above the midpoint of that midpoint E, because Z is directly above the midpoint TZ. So by construction, that E is the midpoint of this line. That means by linear invariance, because I get from this game to this game by just taking alternatives away from the W player, the fair outcome for the game with the frontier of my bar is at E, by construction. Finally, what independence of irrelevant alternatives says is, if outcomes were available in a game and they were not the fair outcome, if you take those irrelevant outcomes away, it shouldn't affect the game. Notice how I get to the game with the AB frontier from that line. I take away these points which were available but not the fair outcome, and I take away those points which are available but not the fair outcome. So by independence of irrelevant alternatives, what's the fair outcome in the frontier AB? It's the point E again. So I can uniquely define from those four principles a fair outcome on that frontier. And that's the Nash theorem. It's that simple to prove. But it has a certain characteristic which is really where he came out on the Nash bargaining equilibrium. So here's E and here is that line. Here is Z, here is T, here is Y, here is A, and sorry, it should be up there at, say, Z. I'm sorry, Y, no, X. Let me put X there. So there's that point E. What's the slope of the curve AB at E? Well, it's just the slope of this line because the line XY is tangent to the curve there. The slope also represents that as you move and take stuff away from A and give it to B, it's the amount that A sacrifices for every incremental bit he gives to B. So it's the change in A's payoff divided by the change in B's payoff. But what's the slope of that line also equal to? And let me connect TE. This distance is equal to that distance. What does that mean is true of this angle and this angle? They've got to be equal. So the slope of that line and the slope of that line is equal. What's the slope of this line? It's the total gain above the threat point from A divided by the total gain above the threat point from B. And this point is where those two slopes are equal. I'm just going to do a little rearrangement and do the change in A divided by A, which is I'm going to bring that down there and I'm going to bring that up there, is equal to the change in B divided by B. Why is that so interesting? This is the percentage of the total gain that he obtains from cooperation that A gives up. If that number is smaller than the percentage gain in B's cooperation, what should A do? Make the concession. So if the percentage loss of gain to A is less than the percentage gain to B, A should make the concession. When that continues at the fair outcome, what's true of the concessions? That the percentage loss to A is just equal to the percentage gain to B. Those two slopes are the same. So the Nash bargaining principle is that when you're bargaining along the frontier, a fair outcome is an outcome of equal percentage sacrifice. Now, that is almost irrelevant in your lives, except in a sense that I'm going to describe in a second. The important things about fairness are individual rationality and symmetry, not being greedy about 50-50, and sometimes linear invariance. This principle, as I say in life, is almost irrelevant. But it is a brilliant intellectual achievement. For him to sit down, and did you ever see the movie A Beautiful Mind? Okay. It's not cooperating to get the blondes that matters. It's how you divide up the blondes fairly. That is the essence of what John Nash did. And to get from these principles of fair division to this principle of equal percentage sacrifice, which actually has broader applications that you could imagine in tax policy and government policy, is an extraordinarily brilliant achievement. You can do at least as well as that in the world if you'll just remember to cooperate. Take off.
Less music.
But I think that's really interesting. And then there's another one side. It's like when you talk about engineers, you talk about, talking about margins on capital. They're just equal to or less than the cost of capital. If it's not a competitive industry, then you just got to know what they are.
Like intuitive to figure out whether there's like more operational leverage.
That's just capital intensity. So if they want margins on sales, what really is important is margins on capital. And the more capital intensive the industry is, the higher the margins on sales. So there are two things you have to think about. One is the capital intensity margins, if they're asking about sales margins versus public versus returns on capital. And the second thing is the barriers to entry.
Products very interesting ideas. They looked at the logistics industry and said that like up to 40 sales they were usually profitable. Then they had a dip, and then they were a complete upside.
What do you think the profitability in the logistics industry is?
On scale?
Where?
When I was
because that's where you acquire the customers, and that's where you do it. Nobody's going to own refrigerated scale in China. There'll be lots of people who do that. But if you are the biggest shipper to Rhode Island, and all your trucks are concentrated in Rhode Island, when you break the things down to the ship, and your warehouses dominate Rhode Island, and your service and sales force goes to Rhode Island, who's going to make the money in Rhode Island?
I think like what his point was like that at some point in time
he's not talking geography in logistics. His point is stupid.
Like what is that at some point in time like bigger systems, like let's say if you're a retailer, if you're just
systems are available for sale off the shelf from other companies. Now mom and pops don't make much money. But the truth is, it's the people with the local economies who are going. So Kuehne & Nagel owns the Far East Europe routes, Expeditors owns the Far East West Coast routes, and a lot of the other people just don't make much money. Okay?
Thanks.
Again, the hardest thing with the restaurant industry is customer care. As you move down the scale, starting with food at home, cheap fast food, especially young people, they want the same temptation all of the same taste sensation again. So you have a lot of customer captivity, and if you get local scale for buying supplies, for supervision, advertising, they make money. As you move upscale, people want variety, and there's no customer captivity, and nobody ever makes money for a long period of time. Cracker Barrel is unfortunately too upscale. Right, and but there's a... Well, I know, but the thing about Cracker Barrel, McDonald's does reasonably well expanding into new markets adjacent. Cracker Barrel, to survive, has to be well run because it doesn't have the activity. That means to be well run, we'll talk about this in the last class, you have to be focused. So when the Cracker Barrels of the world leave their home markets and go someplace else, they always go back.
What they are doing, they're expanding.
So that's great. That's still reasonably well. As long as they're locally focused, they'll be fine, but they'll never do that. Because they don't have to. Because, people steal. They'll go there, they'll go to Olive Garden, they'll go to other things, so they're never, and that means they're always going to try something else. Yes.
What they're doing
Right. It's an issue of efficiency. Right. If you've got the talent to... The problem with managing it yourself is, again, the more you expand geographically, the more you dilute your management talent, and you don't rely on people. So it's a piece with Cracker Barrel's local discipline in expanding, but it's really an efficiency question. Okay?
That's why I came to conclusion for the restaurant.
Okay.
For my paper.
It's a great paper.
Just a quick question on how cooperation have on innovation.
It turns out that you can't say. So what's the greatest innovative institution in modern world? And it's an institution that did the transistor, that did fiber optics, that did microwave communication, that did cellular telephones, that did satellite communication, that did practically information theory, you name it. What institution is that? It's Bell Labs. And it was part of the phone company. So you have examples of the Pasteur Institute where there are big local, big economies of scale and very smart people in a stable environment. And you have other cases where, and the big universities have been big stable universities, and they do a lot of successful innovation. And then you've got these informal models like Silicon Valley, like the biotech centers in Boston and other places, where as long as you're all together, you get those agglomeration economies, and somehow you don't need the stability
It comes from being in a large organization and the continuity of effort. It comes from that and lots of little things together. It's a terrific thing to write a paper about if you want to write a paper. And you ought to look at the data and talk to people and see where they come in. Okay?
I had a concept question actually, just in terms of entry preemption.
Right.
For the incumbent, when we talked about the strategy, you said that they should try to occupy as much of the niches as possible. And that kind of sounded like it was counter.
No. I hope this discussion will be what he should have thought about